Good morning. I'm always hesitant to read the entire scripture text because sometimes it's as long as a sermon when you get into some of these gospel stories. I do want to do something, though, if you'll just forgive me for a moment. Most of you are aware that the church has been having some financial issues. First of all, I want to advise you this is nothing new. We are approaching 200 years as a church. I suspect we can't find 10 years in our history when we were not having financial issues. Just read our history sometimes. Our first two prophets both tried to sell the Kirtland Temple to pay bills. Neither one could do it, but they tried nonetheless. But what I want to talk about more than anything else was, and I'm sharing this in any congregation I go into, to make sure that the membership understands the way that we pay tithing in this church is different than any church in the world that I'm aware of right now. And that is, most every church going, you make an offering, and that money is divided between the local congregation and the denomination. In ours, it is not. Unless you specify that the money you're giving, or some of it is going to the world church, it all stays locally. That's under some examination in the church, but I just wanted to let you know that that's how we do it, because in every congregation I've been in, there is some misunderstanding about that. And I can understand why that's the case, because the denomination I came from, it all went to one location. If that congregation chose to share with an association, that was their choice at least. I'm going to add a cough drop here. I had a friend about my age who, ever since I've known him, sang. He started singing for funerals when he was like 14, 15, weddings, and all kinds of occasions. He was quite a good singer. And he took a job at the funeral home there in town. There was one only. And I was there for a relative's funeral a few years ago, and I said, "Richard, do you still sing?" He says, "No." He said, "Most of our funerals in the morning, it's at least noon before my voice is cleared up anymore since I turned, I think he said 75 or whatever it was, so I finally had to give it up because I can't trust my voice." Well, same thing with me sometimes. I don't know for sure when mine's going to work or not, so thank you for bringing the water here. Is there anyone here, other than Craig and me, who remember a set of missionary slides we used to use called Go Ye and Teach? Okay, so everybody who raised their hands, you're old, because they haven't been used now for, I'm going to say, for 30 years or more. For the rest of you, in essence, and I've been thinking about this ever since I saw the title, because I came into the church in my 30s, and the elders of the church came out to go through what we call cottage meetings. This is basically where it takes two of them to carry all the paraphernalia in, because they'd bring in a slide projector, they'd bring in a screen, and all kinds of stuff, so almost need to bring a little wagon in to set this stuff up to show you these slides. And I was a slow learner, so they went through them twice with me, and then I thought about this morning. Was it Jim who was saying, somebody said, "I'd like to be sure about things." I didn't want to come into this church until I was sure it was the right move. And I never got that assurance. I finally had to realize through talking to somebody that coming and making that movement to join this church was an act of faith. And I have never been totally assured with the certainty of anything in my life. There's always an element of doubt. That's the way I'm built, I guess. But nonetheless, in these slides, it starts off with the foundation of a building. And the cornerstone is Jesus Christ, and it takes it from Ephesians 2. And I started doing these before I'd been in the church 6 months. I was out helping other people do these cottage meetings, if you will. So I had to buy all my paraphernalia too, Had to get bigger screen. I got a 50-inch screen, realizing you can't even fit that in a car in some cases. But nonetheless, my heart was in the right place, I guess. But nonetheless, so you go through these slides, and then you build from the cornerstone, got the apostles, the prophets, you add priesthood offices, and you have a very traditional looking stone church when you're completed with everything there. The different offices, the gifts of the Spirit are the steps into the church, all these kind of things at least. If you look in any directory of churches, you'll see the word Cornerstone in a church's name hundreds of times. A page or two alone just in the Cincinnati area. There's Cornerstone Baptist Church, Cornerstone Methodist Church, Cornerstone Apostolic Church, just the Cornerstone Church. And all over the place, indicating that they take very seriously that they are in fact staying true to the teachings of Jesus in their church. Now we all know that being a church in the last 20 or 30 years has been more difficult than we'd like to have it be. That's true everywhere. We usually try to find some way to assess blame when we see these things happen. There's one denomination with which we're probably all familiar that's closing down 2 or 3 congregations a day on average. They're made up of small and large congregations, and the small ones are going out of business at a very rapid rate. By comparison, we're doing quite well. We close down 1 every few years in our mission center at least. They're closing down 2 or 3 a day on average. The blame we typically affix when we're trying to determine when a church is not going well is usually on external forces. The problem's always out there. The problem is always somewhere other than located here. Ken and I were talking this morning about Sunday soccer. When I was part of the Loveland Ministerial Association, the question we got raised more times than not was, what the preacher's going to do about Sunday soccer? It's keeping our churches from functioning. I say this as my grandson has just concluded his Sunday morning game right now, and because they won, I've been getting updates, by the way. They'll be playing for the championship this afternoon. But Sunday morning soccer, terrible, terrible thing. I took him to a gathering at it may have been Cornerstone Baptist Church, a big Baptist church a while back. One of his classmates was recruiting, and they asked free pizza and games, all kinds of things. And he said, in very small print in there, it says, gospel message. Gospel message. He says, what's that mean? And this was the preacher's going to talk. Well, the preacher did talk for 45 minutes. The pizza was getting cold. But anyhow, he says, why is it in such small print? He says, well, we don't want people who haven't been saved to know that that's what they're going to be talking about again in there. But while I was waiting for him to get out of this thing, and when they got through, they had hundreds of youth coming out of there. They had about, I'd say 75 to 100 pizzas there to feed these kids, and enough for 2 per kid. But the Wednesday evening service was also concluding. They made me look young when they came out of there. Nobody under the age of 70, I don't think, attends their Wednesday evening services in this large, large church. And I don't know what they would blame it on necessarily. People say, well, if we could put prayer back in schools again, well, if we could put Bible back in school again, if we could do this again. If we get people to say Merry Christmas now, how many times do you see that on Facebook? Say Merry Christmas. Yeah, say Merry Christmas, but don't condemn the people who are saying Happy Holidays, because it's also other holidays as well, So anyhow, I put my foot in it one day at the Ministerial Association meeting and said, what are we going to do about the schools taking up Sundays with their sports activities? I said, we have been taking up someone else's Sabbath for 50 years with our football games on Friday night, and no one has ever thought for a minute about the number of people who go to church on Friday or Saturday because that's their Sabbath. We have assumed that we're the only ones who have a Sabbath. Well, I wasn't uninvited, but I don't think it was a very popular point of view. The thing of it is, it's an issue that is not, we can't just take a Christian perspective on it. It's an issue of what is the role of faith in a lot of locations, at least. A lot of congregations look around with a great deal of envy at some of these congregations that seem to be growing. I just mentioned one where they have, they can get kids out there for some period of time with pizza. Also interesting that I did find out how you can overcome Sunday morning soccer, because one of my grandson's teammates' parents said, "Can you take Kyle to the game on Sunday morning because we want to go to church?" I said, "Wow, that's a pretty good deal." He says, "If you go 4 Sundays in a row, you get a $100 gift certificate, and we want to make sure we get that certificate." And that was their 4th Sunday. So, now you know, in case you were looking for growth, go to Sam's and buy gift certificates and find creative ways to use them at least. Anyway, you got the okay, a line in the budget, yeah. So when you pass the plate, take out what you need and see how much you wind up at the end, My father-in-law, who I never met because he died when my wife was 8, was very devoted to fill out his tithing statements, which they did back in those days. And he had to accounted for his income, and one of his income was $1.50 he took from an offering plate. He claimed on his tithing statement he didn't have enough money for the family, so he took $1.50 out of the offering and confessed to the church in his statement he'd done that. The scripture today is one of 3 parables that take place right in the temple in Matthew. They're all long. You have to go back to the first one to realize that Jesus is talking to the leaders of the church, to the chief priest and elders, maybe the scribes, I'm not too sure, at the various locations at least. And in this particular one today, there is a landowner who has leased his fields out. I'm going to try to summarize it. He sends his slaves out to get his share of the profits, and they beat the slaves up. He sends another bunch of slaves out. The same thing happens. He sends his son out, and they kill him, which brings us to the scriptures on the back of the bulletin today that I'll read. And Jesus said to them, this is after this happened, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom." Most all of the New Testament, probably all of the scriptures we have, were written during times of crisis, addressing people who were in times of crisis. Matthew was written at a time when there are a lot of external forces going on around them. You have to look at when it was written, not when the setting is. The setting is when Jesus was alive. It was written 40, 50, 60 years after that. So when you're writing in a particular setting, the things you choose to put in your work are things that will address the people you're writing to. It's not just a history, it is a gospel. So, he is writing at a time when the Jewish war is over with. They lost badly. The temple's been destroyed. There is a separation coming between the Jews and the Gentiles, where the Jewish Christians are being kicked out of the synagogues, and religious persecution has begun. It's been going on for 10 or 12 years, from the days of Nero at least, but it's out there too. So this is the kind of world it's being written to. Can we say there's a lot of external influences going on here? So you would expect today's text to say, here's how you deal with these external influences, but it's not saying that. It says the problem's not out there, it's in here. It's us. The church is rejecting Jesus. the church is rejecting the message of Jesus. These parables were all given to people who would have recognized that the vineyard that's being described is also a metaphor for the temple. It was a fairly common metaphor in those days. Jesus is being rejected by his own household. The church leaders are rejecting the stone which holds up the house. I had not heard what Amy just shared today before. How technology has removed the need for a cornerstone. You can make a sermon out of that. Has technology removed the need for Jesus? Nonetheless, that's a different sermon. Greg Gerald is a pastor in Charlotte, North Carolina. I don't know what his denomination is, and it makes no difference. In September 2016, a man named Keith Scott was killed by police. He was African American. They still do not agree on whether or not he was armed. They still have debates about that. But nonetheless, there was a huge protest, week-long protest about racial inequality and oppression and justice. A lot of the Charlotte clergy joined in. It didn't seem to make a difference in the denomination or anything like that. Pastors from huge congregations, pastors from little storefront churches, just joined in from everywhere, you know. But one of the questions that came up as the clergy were talking together is, what is our role here? What is our role in protests like this? So they went to the people who'd organized the protest and asked the question, what is our role? They said, stay in your own lane. Well, that sounds kind of, stay out of our business. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is you need to be authentic in your own sphere of influence. Don't try to be in charge of organizing something like that, because we know the pastors tend to be managerial. We've already got people who are skilled in that. Don't try to do work that's being done by others. Don't duplicate something. Be true to your own sphere of influence. Be what you're called to be and do what you're called to do. And most importantly, get used to being uncomfortable. So as this week-long protest was ending on Saturday, on Saturday night, almost all the clergy had left. They had to get ready to preach the next morning. They're all like us. They do their sermons, I guess, 10 o'clock Saturday night or something. Anyway, only two guys left, Greg and an African-American minister, who neither one had assignments the next morning. About 24 protesters were left and 70 riot police, all in their full gear there. At midnight, they announced a curfew had started. Anyone who did not leave immediately was subject to being arrested and put in jail. So here are these two pastors trying to determine, what should we do? We don't want to wind up in jail, but it somehow doesn't seem right that we just bail out and leave. And so the stay in your own lane thing came back into their minds again. What is it that we know how to do? Pray and preach. Those are things that we do all the time. So first, they went out in the street and they knelt in prayer. All of the 24 or so protesters knelt with them, and they prayed aloud for some period of time. Then they started to preach, and their congregation was the 70 riot police there. And it says it was all improvised, but basically, if you kind of summarize, it went something like this. Do you believe it is the moral thing to do to obey the orders you have been given and hurt your own neighbors and destroy peace where there's no violence being exhibited? They spoke to the humanity of the police, spoke of their love and their desire for a better world, and how what they were doing might interfere with that desire for a better world. And the police packed their stuff up and got on the buses and left. He said, I don't know why they left. Was it our prayers? Was it our preaching? Were they all tired? Don't know why they all left, but they did, and no one was arrested. He summarized his thoughts, and this is where I'm getting my information from. He summarized his thoughts in something like this. Like, he's not like go and do likewise, but what can I learn from this? Well, for one thing is be present. Be present to those and do what you're able to do and do it without fear. Number one is you show up. Show up in the streets if that's called for. Show up in the sanctuary. Show up in community meetings. Show up anywhere that the message of peace may be proclaimed. Show up wherever those who have been disinherited by the system, to give them a voice. Show up to be their voices when they can't do it for themselves. Show up and use your gifts in ways that combat oppression, and especially show up when it's uncomfortable. Now, I talk to a lot of people who are members of Community of Christ who don't attend Community of Christ, maybe not anywhere else. And some of them will tell me that their congregation's Camp Bountiful. They tend to be people that I see at Camp Bountiful a lot. They've been going there for years and years. And I never ask them why they don't go to church, because I know they're going to tell me before long, and they always do. And you can summarize it very easily in just about one or two categories. The general sentiment is, I want to attend a church that looks like the church that's on your website. I want to attend a church that practices what it says in your statements of beliefs, which says that in some cases the congregation has a disconnect from what we say that we believe and we do. I've had seekers tell me the same thing. And the seekers first go to our website. What a lovely church. And then try to find one. Some of them found the church here and have found one, by the way. I don't want you to leave here feeling bad, because when I get requests for recommendations for churches in this area, I always talk about Grove City. If they don't show up, maybe that's my recommendation not working right. I don't know. There's a book that I have called The Church on Purpose. It's a small one. You can read it in an afternoon. But it basically talks about the church has one of the greatest purposes going. But said any organization whose purpose is so easily defined is in great danger of forgetting to follow its own purpose. It's like the easier it is to define your purpose, the more easy it is to forget it, which seems kind of strange about a church. But if you start to think about it, you can probably think of examples of this, if you will. He gives examples in this book about a lot of different organizations who have continued to do things well beyond their sell-by date. And I'm going to use one of the examples, but I will not be able to give it the right information, because it has to do with a mortar crew or cannon crew or something in the Army. And I believe that at the time several years ago, the standard crew was 5 or 6 people or something like that. Basically, the Jeep would bring in the cannon, back it up, unhook the Jeep, and the crew one person would load the shell, one person would unload the spent shell, one person is the commander, one person would remount the bore, and the other 2 people there, whenever the commander said fire, they would salute. Someone who was unfamiliar with the practice said, "What are those guys doing there who're saluting?" I don't know. They're part of the crew. But why are they part of the crew? Are they there for backup or something? No, we just always had it that way. So the guy, being somewhat curious, started to dig into it and found out that back in the days when the mortars or the cannons, whatever they're called, were first used, they were drawn by a pair of draft horses. Draft horses are not real crazy about cannons going on around them, so when they were unhooked, each one was assigned a private to hang on to the harness so they wouldn't run away when the firing took place. When they started using motorized vehicles, and it had been going on now for 30 or 40 years when this story was told, they didn't need those other 2 people. What did they do? Well, they're going to salute. So you got 2 people doing nothing other than riding in the Jeep and saluting when somebody shoots the gun off. Sometimes churches still are saluting something that no longer exists, you know. I call them the ghost of churches. We sometimes have congregations who have ghosts in them. They aren't haunted. There's one that I can tell you right now. When they do things on a Sunday morning, I realize that they're doing it based on this guy who was pastor there in the 1950s. He's the one who told them to do things that way, and they still do it that way. They never question it. They just do it that way. Some people have served their communion in certain ways too, and they will never vary from that. We can't do that because that's how we were taught to do it. I'm not suggesting this is the case with Grove City. In fact, I don't think it is. I'm suggesting it's always a possibility to forget where we're anchored, what anchors us at least. I've heard from enough people and experienced conversation with enough people to know that there's a high level of care and concern and ministry that takes place in this congregation. And I'm thankful for that. I'm only asking that you always continue to remember who the church is built on and how you can best find and keep the lane on which you're to travel. And may you be blessed, for the discomfort of the kingdom is my prayer. Amen.